Hello, friends. Well, I think yesterday I got about halfway through the first chapter of Ernest Sato's Japanese book collection at Cambridge University Library, which I've been reading. So I think I'll just pick up from yesterday. Let me just find the screen to share so we can all see where we are. Yeah, okay. There's a slight overlap from yesterday, but I'm going to start page 44, who was the real publisher of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō? Whose plan was it to publish the first printed edition of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō? At this point, I want to return to this question. In this book, I have already stated my hypothesis that it was Honma Kozo. Below, I will give the basis for this guess. First, in the appendix Furoku of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, the name of the author-cum-publisher is given as Honma Mitsunori, but it is said that Honma Kozo used the name of his eldest son. At the time when Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was published, Honma Mitsunori had opened a dental practice in Tokyo. It may be that Honma Kozo had some reason for not using his own name and for using his son's name instead. The same thing applies to the appendix of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Why did Kozo avoid using his own name? This is a mystery. Was it perhaps because he was working at the police department? Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was published in 1889, Meiji 22, but a similar thing occurred in the following year, 1890, Meiji 23. Once again, Honma Kozo published using the name of his eldest son, this time the title being Kikuchi Yosai o Zufu, illustrated reference book of the old painter Kikuchi Yosai, 1788 to 1878. It is a publication of copies and scaled-down drawings of Kikuchi's works by his pupil Matsumoto Fuko, 1840 to 1923. Why did Kozo not use his own name, but that of his eldest son? The strange thing is that this book, like Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, was published in the following year under a different name, that of Okura Magobe, 1843 to 1921. It seems that 1 year later, Kozo assigned the publishing rights to Okura Magobe. Okura, born in the same year as Ernest Sato, by the way. I wonder if he's a member of the famous Okura family. At the start of the appendix to Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, there is a preface in the name of Suhara Izo. It seems that he was the author of that preface, in other words, Suhara Tetsuji of Isando. But if we examine the content of the preface, the probability that it was actually written by Honma Kozo is high. Again, he was writing under the name of another person instead of his own. It seems likely that Suhara Tetsuji of Isando just lent his name to Honma Kozo, the same as Honma Mitsunori. In the printed version of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, apart from the main text, Honpen, there are surprisingly 2 appendices included. One of these is a Gesakusha Ryakuden, biographical sketches of novelists, which includes Gesaku Rokkasen and Gesakusha Shoden, both contained in Enseki Jushu, which was edited by Iwamoto Katoshi, Darumaya Sahichi. Gesakusha Ryakuden contains Gesaku Rokkasen and Gesakusha Shoden together. Why were these 2 put together in one volume? Was it connected with the pictures, sashie? Gesaku Ryakuden is an appendix, but the number of pages is more than the main text. The second appendix, described as a furoku, is an extract from a lecture by Ernest Hart on Japanese drawings and paintings as works of art. In the printed version of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, why were appendices added to the main text? It was perhaps the case that the publisher, Honma Kozo, judged that the main text, Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, was not enough to be published on its own, and so he added the appendices to enlarge the volume. It may also have been important that self-portraits were included in the Gesaku Rokkasen. However, the number of novelists included in the Gesaku Rokkasen was not many, so this was why the Gesakusha Shoden was added. Furthermore, Ernest Sato had possessed a manuscript copy of Gesaku Rokkasen in his former collection, which is now held at Cambridge University Library. In some, very few, of Sato's ex libris books, there are notes in pencil, and it seems that he did read or peruse Gesaku Rokkasen. How did it come into his possession? When he was building his collection, he seems to have acquired the Gesaku Rokkasen at a relatively early stage. What is very interesting about the copy of Gesaku Rokkasen held by Cambridge University Library is the seal in the book, which is Kofuku-an. During the Bakumatsu, the Western scholar Yanagawa Shunsan, 1830 to 1870, published a book of Japanese arithmetic, Wasansho, titled Sampo Chinsho, Rare Book of Arithmetic, under the pen name Sharakusai Tojin, and it is possible that sorry, how did you read that again? I have to go back to the previous page. Kofuku-an was his seal. So was this copy of Gesaku Rokkasen formerly in Yanagawa Shunsan's collection? Furthermore, as a variant of or similar name to Toshusai Sharaku, there is the name Sharakusai. Is there some connection between the Sharaku in Sharakusai and the Sharaku in Sharakusai Tojin, which is written differently, as you can see there? And does Tojin, in this case, mean foreigner? Either way, I would like to know the route by which Sato acquired a copy of Gesaku Rokkasen. Moreover, in the early Meiji period, Takabatake Ransen Ryūtei Tanehiko III, 1838 to 1885, was active, and in his former collection was the manuscript Gesaku Rokkasen, which was the original text for Ansei Sannen Katoshi Jo. Ransen's former collection is now in the library of Kansai University. Takabatake Ransen Ryūtei Tanehiko III will be referred to again in connection with Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō. When Honma Kozo published Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, it seems that the only appendix which he added at first to the main text was Iwamoto Katoshi's Gesakusha Ryakuden. After that, when in the final stages of publication, Kozo happened to acquire a copy of an extract of Ernest Hart's lecture, Appendix. It seems likely that he added that extract to the printed book, Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, at that stage. But the important thing about the addition of Ernest Hart's lecture extract to Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō is that Hart's lecture was thought to have relevance to Ukiyo-e ruikō, which is why Honma Kozo, in his capacity as publisher, added it. If there had been no perceived connection, there would have been no point in adding it. Ernest Hart's lecture extract was inserted as an appendix to Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. In the first part of that appendix, as previously mentioned, a preface was inserted. In that preface, the circumstances of how the lecture extract was included are recorded. The date of the preface is given as May 1889, Meiji 22, early summer, Shoka. I shall comment on this date later. The author of the preface is given as Suhara Izo, in other words, Suhara Tetsuji. But on careful examination of the content of the preface, it seems probable that the real author was Honma Kozo. At least it can be assumed that it was not Suhara Izo. According to the publication data of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, it was printed in 1889, Meiji 22, on June the 5th, and published on June 10th, just 1 month after the preface was written. According to the preface of the appendix, Suhara Izo, Honma Kozo, had finished the work of compilation of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō and was just about to publish it when a friend brought a book to his notice in which Ernest Hart's lectures about the history of Japanese art were contained. At the same time, when Suhara, Honma, read it, Hart's detailed history of Japanese art had just been completed. In contrast, Japan's situation in this field, i.e. promoting Japanese art, was very disappointing. This is why Suhara, Honma, greatly admired Hart's work. So he states that he extracted that part of the lectures, the third one, and inserted it as an appendix in the printed version of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. The part of the preface which is of interest is where it is stated that he, Honma Kozo, perused an English book brought to him by a friend and extracted Hart's third lecture to make an appendix. It may be that Suhara Tetsuji was able to understand English to some extent, but it is inconceivable that his command of English was such that he could, in a short time, make an extract from the English essay. On the other hand, Honma Kozo had the experience of travel overseas, working in the foreign section of the police department, the police authority of the Ministry of the Interior, and he could easily read the English book and make an extract of part of it. Later, I shall comment on the nature of this book and the identity of the friend who brought the book to his attention. Ernest Hart's lecture about Japanese art. Now I would like to explain the content of Ernest Hart's lecture on Japanese art and the process by which the Japanese language translation extract from it came to be included in the published book Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. Ernest Hart was a medical doctor and for many years the editor of the British Medical Journal, BMJ. The BMJ continues in circulation nowadays, and Hart was a well-known editor. Hart and William Anderson were friends, and the latter was also a medical doctor. They were both involved in medical education in London and worked as teaching staff at medical schools. Furthermore, they were both former pupils of the City of London School before they trained as doctors. When Anderson sold his collection of Japanese art in 1882, Meiji 15, or more precisely at the end of 1881, Meiji 14, to the British Museum, he did not sell his entire collection to the museum. The part not bought by the British Museum was bought by Ernest Hart. This was the start of Hart's collection of Japanese art in 1882, which he later developed. It seems probable that the British Museum's acquisition of Anderson's collection concentrated on paintings and pictures, but Hart bought the rest. Thus, the Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, Nishiki-e, which Anderson had collected, were not acquired by the British Museum, but purchased by Hart. Thereafter, Hart rapidly expanded his collection, and by the end of the 19th century, he was the leading collector of Japanese art in Britain. Regarding the Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, Nishiki-e, in the Anderson collection, from a newspaper article in the Times of December 25, 1907, Acquisitions at the British Museum Print Room, we know the following. When the British Museum purchased the greater part of the Anderson collection, Anderson appears to have excluded the Ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Thus, the British Museum did not acquire any of his Ukiyo-e woodblock prints. However, the museum did buy the Ukiyo-e hand-painted with their own hand by Hokusai and others. The greater part of the Ukiyo-e woodblock prints in the Anderson collection were purchased by Hart. Some of these prints were later acquired by the British Museum from Hart's widow after his death. This will be explained in detail later. Hart's collection consisted of Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, etc., and included many areas of Japanese art. The two Japanese who helped him expand it were Hayashi Tadamasa, 1853 to 1906, and Wakai Kanesaburo, 1834 to 1908. Hayashi was the subordinate and junior kohai of Wakai in a trading company which exported Japanese art overseas, called the Kiritsu Kosho Gaisha. Hayashi Tadamasa was from 1878, Meiji 10, resident in Paris, and travelled in many parts of Europe. In 1885, Meiji 18, he resided in London and assisted in the cataloguing and putting in order of the Japanese works of art at the British Museum and the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert Museum. It was probably on advice or recommendation of Anderson, that Hayashi was employed by both museums for a short time. In the South Kensington Museum, he corrected the labels on Japanese works of art, and to check them, he was employed at the museum for 2 weeks. And then in the following year, 1886, Meiji 19, Hayashi Tadamasa came again to London to assist Ernest Hart in the exhibition of his Japanese artworks. When a lecture series was organized about Hart's Japanese artworks, at the lecture hall, an exhibition of Japanese art was also held, organized by Hayashi Tadamasa. He also assisted in the production of the classified catalogue of the exhibition. Furthermore, in the catalogue, to help students of Japanese art, he added a guide or index, shihyo, including reviews, explanations, and opinions. It is likely that he not only assisted with the exhibition, but also helped Ernest Hart with the content of the lecture. In the same year, 1886, Hayashi set up his base in Paris as an independent dealer in Japanese art. Anderson, Hart, and others were his important customers in London. In Britain, from the middle of the 18th century, there existed an academic society called the Society of Arts, based in London. In 1908, Meiji 41, it was granted a royal charter by the British royal family, and the name changed to the Royal Society of Arts. Ernest Hart gave 3 lectures in a series to the Society in May 1886, May 1919, about Japanese art. The main text of Hart's lectures was published in the Journal of the Society of Arts in October 1886. There were many editions of the Society's journal. The main text of Hart's lectures, which appeared over many editions of the Journal of the Society of Arts and the catalogue of the exhibition, were republished together in a booklet or book in 1887, Meiji 20. When they were republished, in addition, an index was added of the artists' names, marks, and signatures, of course prepared by Hayashi Tadamasa. Since he had collaborated in the preparation of Hart's lecture and the catalogue, he probably received a complimentary copy of the booklet from Hart. Indeed, he may have received several copies. Then on his return to Japan at some point, he must have shown the booklet to Honma Kozo. As will be stated in detail later, Hayashi Tadamasa returned to Japan in 1886, Meiji 19, after 8 years abroad, but very soon he left again for America. In the summer of 1888, Meiji 19, he again returned to Japan, and this time he stayed until May of the following year. It must have been during this second return to Japan that he showed the republished books of Hart's lecture and the catalogue to Honma Kozo, and it can be presumed that it was at this time that Kozo began to be involved in the export of Japanese artworks, Ukiyo-e, etc., overseas, like Hayashi. Furthermore, Hart's lecture was translated into Japanese, and its insertion into the published version of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was referred to even in a British newspaper article. It was written by a person who had no knowledge at all of Japanese, so that Ukiyo-e ruikō was written Ukiyo-rinko, Ukiyo-e became Ukiyo, and ruikō became rinko. Again, separately from its inclusion in Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, Hart's lecture was translated by the Cabinet's official Gazette translation section, Naikaku Kampo Kyoku Honnyakuka, as Nihon Bijutsu Shinsetsu, a new theory of Japanese art, and published in 1887, Meiji 20, in the Cabinet's official Gazette. The translation was probably undertaken at the recommendation of Hayashi Tadamasa. Also, in the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper in December of the previous year, a summary of Hart's lecture had been published. It is unclear where and how Honma Kozo and Hayashi Tadamasa first became acquainted. They may have got to know each other through the police department. They had also in common that they had both traveled to France. It is possible that Hayashi Tadamasa, before he went to France for the first time, met Honma Kozo in Japan and asked him various things about Paris, etc. At any rate, it seems clear that Kozo's involvement with Japanese art, such as ukiyo-e, was greatly influenced by his own experience of travel abroad, but the fact of Hayashi Tadamasa's being in the art-dealing trade was probably another major factor. Honma Kozo no doubt had Hayashi's example in mind, and this caused him to become a collector and dealer in ukiyo-e, particularly those drawn by the artists in their own hand. Hayashi Tadamasa, when collecting ukiyo-e and Japanese works of art, also may have received assistance from Honma Kozo, who was working in the police department. Here I would like once more to summarize Hayashi Tadamasa's attitude with regard to ukiyo-e ruikō. Hayashi was living in Paris when in 1886, Meiji 19, he crossed over to Britain and assisted Hart with his lecture and the accompanying exhibition. Again, in 1886, Meiji 19, William Anderson's two great works, Descriptive and Historical Catalogue, etc., and Pictorial Arts of Japan were published. Anderson was an important customer for Hayashi Tadamasa. As will be stated afterwards, Anderson's Descriptive and Historical Catalogue included reference works in Japanese. Among these, the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was included as an important source for ukiyo-e research in manuscript form. Later, I will indicate the ways in which Anderson and Sato made use of Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Ukiyo-e ruikō and Hayashi Tadamasa. Perhaps he had felt it slightly for some time before, but at the latest by the middle of the 1880s, Hayashi Tadamasa realized that the document, manuscript, called Ukiyo-e ruikō was important, and that he should by all means obtain a copy. Then he actually did obtain one. With regard to the type of manuscript, an explanation will be given later. Hayashi Tadamasa returned to Japan in 1886, Meiji 19, after 8 years overseas. In September of the same year, he went to America, and after that he returned to Paris. In the summer of 1888, Meiji 21, Hayashi Tadamasa again returned to Japan and stayed there until May 1889. Until in May 1889, Meiji 22, he left Japan, heading for the World Fair in Paris, where he was an inspector. Probably from the summer of 1888 until May of the following year, he was looking for a manuscript copy of Ukiyo-e ruikō in Japan. Or perhaps he had obtained a copy before that time and it was already in his possession. If he had acquired it, he may have had a manuscript copy made. Anyway, he did in fact acquire Ukiyo-e ruikō and possessed several manuscript copies. It is to some degree necessary to consider the possibility that Hayashi Tadamasa had already seen the Ukiyo-e ruikō in London in 1886. This is because the Ukiyo-e ruikō is mentioned in Hart's lectures, and naturally Hart, Anderson, and Hayashi Tadamasa would have shared information. And there's the full title of William Anderson's catalogue. Descriptive and Historical Catalogue of a Collection of Japanese and Chinese Paintings in the British Museum, London, 1886. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I just reduce it to Descriptive and Historical Catalogue most of the time. Need to keep going down. Yeah, there we are. Again, as will be mentioned later, in Anderson's Descriptive and Historical Catalogue of a Collection of Japanese and Chinese Paintings in the British Museum, there it is, the full title, published in the same year, Saito Gesshin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō manuscript was cited as a reference work. Of course, the greatest problem is how Anderson made use of Saito Gesshin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, and if Anderson had an original copy or a copy manuscript in his possession in London, it is conceivable that Hayashi Tadamasa also perused it. Also, Hayashi Tadamasa's acquaintance, Honma Kozo, was looking for Ukiyo-e ruikō and before that time had already acquired a manuscript, written copy, of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Kozo published it in June 1889, Meiji 22, as a printed book. He also acquired a copy of Gesaku Rokkasen, which contained portraits of ukiyo-e painters. With regard to what happened to Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō after that, this will be explained later. As mentioned in the preface, Edmond de Goncourt published Utamaro in 1891, Meiji 24, and Hokusai in 1896, Meiji 29. These books are Goncourt's great masterpieces on ukiyo-e. He was an important customer of Hayashi Tadamasa, and Hayashi had supported him by translating Japanese sources and helped him with his research into Japanese art. Goncourt could not read Japanese, so in order to use Japanese sources, he relied on cooperation from Hayashi Tadamasa. And also Paul Misha we heard about in the preface. Yeah, the state of their relationship is recorded in their exchange of letters and Goncourt's diary. Anyway, the background to Goncourt's being able to publish Utamaro and Hokusai was Hayashi Tadamasa's cooperation with the translation of Japanese sources. Ukiyo-e ruikō is, of course, an important documentary source for research into Utamaro and other ukiyo-e painters. As mentioned in the preface, Goncourt was also well aware of this. In the first part of Utamaro, just before the part already quoted in the preface, Goncourt writes the following. It is the part where he mentions Utamaro's place and year of birth. He, Utamaro, according to recent research, was born in Musashi no Kuni, Kawagoe, in 1754. He was not born in Edo, as stated in Santo Kyoden's handwritten Ukiyo-e ruikō, as revised by Shikite Samba, Mumeo, Saito Gesshin, and Ryūtei Tanehiko. As we know from the above quotation, Goncourt clearly referred to the manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō with help from Hayashi Tadamasa and others. Then the next question is, which manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō did Goncourt refer to? The answer is contained in Goncourt's own statement. Goncourt mentions the following people as having been involved in the revision of Ukiyo-e ruikō: Santo Kyoden, Shikite Samba, Mumeo, Keisai Eisen, Saito Gesshin, and Ryūtei Tanehiko. Among those listed, it is strange that Ryūtei Tanehiko is included, and as the last person. The reason why he was included is that Goncourt, in other words, Hayashi Tadamasa, was using the manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō, edited by Ryūtei Tanehiko III, Takabatake Ransen, called Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō, the Tanehiko book. Following me so far? Furthermore, in his Hokusai, published in 1896, Meiji 29, in the same way, the people involved with Ukiyo-e ruikō are listed, but Santo Kyōzan, 1759 to 1858, the younger brother of Santo Kyoden, is included. With this, it is clear that the manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō, which Goncourt was using, was indeed the one edited by Ryūtei Tanehiko III, Takabatake Ransen, called Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō, Tanehiko book, This is because Santo Kyozan was only involved in the one edited by Takabatake Ransen. Yes, well, I'm also struggling to follow. I'll need to look at it again afterwards. In any case, at the time when Gonkuo's Utamaro was published in 1891, Meiji 24, or strictly speaking by about 1890, Meiji 23, Hayashi Tadamasa already had a copy of the Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō Tanehiko book, edited by Ryūtei Tanehiko III, Takabatake Ransen, and the information about ukiyo-e painters in that Tanehiko book had been shared by Hayashi Tadamasa with Gonkuo. Taking this situation into consideration, from Gonkuo's statement, we can conversely guess the lineage of the manuscript of Ukiyo-e Ruikō, which Hayashi Tadamasa possessed in his collection. Through this kind of process, it has become possible to determine the manuscript of Ukiyo-e Ruikō used by Gonkuo and possessed by Hayashi Tadamasa. Gonkuo exchanged letters with Hayashi Tadamasa, and in the letter dated 2nd of August 1895, Meiji 28, from Gonkuo to Hayashi, there is a reference to Honma Kozo. The content of the letter was that Gonkuo needed a descriptive commentary of a hokusai hanging scroll, kakemono, done in the artist's own hand. Gonkuo was probably looking for a descriptive commentary to include in his book Hokusai to be published the following year, and in the book there is such a commentary. Regarding the descriptive commentary of Hokusai's hanging scroll, Hayashi Tadamasa requested Wakai Kanezaburo, 1834 to 1908, to do it by letter. At that time, Gonkuo attached various conditions. Gonkuo was looking for a person in Japan other than Honma Kozo or an art museum which held Hokusai's scrolls for a descriptive commentary, and this was the premise on which Gonkuo made his request to Hayashi. In this part of the letter, Gonkuo made a point of mentioning Honma's name. The reason for this was that Gonkuo was well aware that Honma Kozo possessed many of Hokusai's hanging scrolls, so perhaps he already had received a descriptive commentary of Honma Kozo's artworks, perhaps either by introduction of Hayashi Tadamasa or by a direct exchange of letters. He had already managed to get in touch with Honma Kozo. Gonkuo was in contact with Honma Kozo, and he may have already bought artworks from him. Let us now return the discussion to the printed book of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. In the preface to the appendix of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, Suhara Honma Kozo writes that the third day of Hart's lectures, the lecture about painting, depends greatly on Ukiyo-e Ruikō. But how did he form this opinion? This was probably based on information shared with Honma by his friends Anderson and Hayashi Tadamasa. Printed and published books after the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, edited by Tatsuya Next, let us summarize the situation regarding Ukiyo-e Ruikō after the publication as a printed book of Tatsuya Shukin's Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, the Isando book. First, the copyright in the Isando book, published in 1889, Meiji 22, had already passed in the following year to Nishimura Roppei of Banshodo. Nishimura changed the cover and the publication date and published it again under the same title of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō in April 1890, Meiji 23. The publishers were Hakubunkan and Shunyodo. This was a republication of the Isando book of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, and this is why it is often called a relaunch, Saihan, of the Isando book. Moreover, in 1891, Meiji 24, Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was published as a volume in the series Kinko Bunge Onchi Sosho, Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, and Kino Yukari, a combined volume. This is usually called the Onchi book. It was published by Hakubunkan. The title is the same as that of Saito Geshin's manuscript, namely Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, but it is said that the manuscript was in the lineage of Keisai Eisen's Mumeo Zuhitsu, Zoku Ukiyo-e Ruikō. The manuscript was not Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. The Onchi book had the same title, but the manuscript is said to be of the lineage of Keisai Eisen's Mumeo Zuhitsu, Zoku Ukiyo-e Ruikō. That appears to be a repeat of the previous sentence, is it? I don't know. That's strange. Furthermore, in the Onchi book, Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, a synopsis is included, which explains how the Onchi book came about as follows. First, it states that this book is a compilation of the manuscripts of several enthusiasts, Kozuka. Saito Geshin's book, Ukiyo-e Ruikō, received various additions and insertions, and the name was changed to Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. But Geshin's book also had various errors and omissions at the transcription stage. That is why the editor of the Onchi book collected several manuscripts of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō and produced the Onchi book Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. But in fact, the basis of the Onchi book Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō is not Saito Geshin's book Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, but Keisai Eisen's Zoku Ukiyo-e Ruikō Mumeyo Zuhitsu, essays by Mumeyo. Yet the title of the Onchi book is the same as Saito Geshin's manuscript Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, so the editor of the Onchi book may have overstated the connection between the two. The Onchi book was in the direct lineage of the Eisen book. Of course, Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was an expanded version of Eisen's Zoku Ukiyo-e Ruikō, which makes the connection between the Onchi book and Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō like that of brothers, not that of parent and child. How interesting. It's almost like genealogy, isn't it? Tracing all these manuscripts and books and the relationship between them. And therefore, the relationship is not like that of brothers, or is like that of brothers, but not of parent and child, is somehow rather striking and appropriate. In 1828, Showa 3, the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was published as part of Part 2, Volume 6, of the Nihon Zuihitsu Taisei. This was like the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, published in 1889, Meiji 23, in that an appendix was included, the Gesakusha Ryakuden. But the extract from a lecture by Ernest Hart on Japanese drawings and paintings as works of art was omitted. We have assumed that the real publisher of the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō in 1889, Meiji 22, was Honma Kozo, but this conclusion can also be reached by what happened after the publication of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. The copyright in the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, published through Isando in 1889, passed in the following year to Nishimura Roppei of Banshodo. Nishimura was originally from Echigo, Gonoshima, but had opened a bookshop in Niigata. Then one of the publishers of the republished Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was Hakubunkan, which was a publishing company founded by Ohashi Sahe, 1836 to 1901, from Nagaoka in Echigo. It seems likely that Honma Kozo, from a Sakata merchant family, would have known a publisher from Echigo. Again, the other publisher was Shunyodo Bookshop, founded by Wada Tokutaro, who had been a former policeman. He seems to have been connected with the police, as was Isando. He was probably an acquaintance of Honma Kozo, who had worked at the police department. Honma Kozo, Nishimura Roppei, and Ohashi Sahe were all from the Japan Sea coast, Dewa or Echigo provinces. Likewise, Hayashi Tadamasa was also from the Japan Sea coast, Etchu Takaoka. It may be that the close geographical proximity of their origins helped to bring Honma and Hayashi together more intimately. Also, Honma Kozo's base, Sakata, was in Yamagata Prefecture, which was a different prefecture to Echigo, Niigata Prefecture, and Etchu Takaoka, Toyama Prefecture. But if we consider transportation from the Japan Sea in the Edo era, these areas must have had close relations between each other. The Ukiyo-e Ruikō, which crossed over to France. As stated above, there was an appendix, Furoku, included in the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, published by Honma Kozo, and according to the preface of that appendix, when Kozo had finished the compilation of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō and was about to publish it, a friend brought Ernest Hart's book to him. Of course, this friend was Hayashi Tadamasa. He had returned to Japan in the summer of 1888, Meiji 21, and left Japan in May of the following year, 1889, Meiji 22, to work as an inspector at the Paris World Fair. Since the date of the preface of the appendix of Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō is the early summer of May 1889, as already mentioned, this confirms the hypothesis that the friend of Honma Kozo was indeed Hayashi Tadamasa. Hayashi Tadamasa left Japan heading for France in May 1889, Meiji 22, but we have no way of knowing what he thought of Honma Kozo's Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, or how he may have been involved in its publication. It would be good to have this information, but there is almost nothing to go on. While Hayashi Tadamasa was staying in Japan, it may be the case that he tried to obtain a manuscript of Ukiyo-e Ruikō, and as will be stated later, he did indeed obtain a Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō, Tanihiko book. Whether Honma Kozo was taught this by Hayashi Tadamasa, or whether he realized it himself, is not clear, but he seems to have considered, like Hayashi, that in order to investigate Ukiyo-e, a manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō was necessary. And Kozo was in fact able to obtain a manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō, for example, Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō. Using this, he published Ukiyo-e ruikō. What kind of clues did Honma Kozo use to search for a manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō? When Kozo published Shinzo-ho Ukiyo-e ruikō, he added as an appendix the Gesakusha Ryakuden. The Gesakusha Ryakuden was included in the Enseki Jishu, edited by Iwamoto Katoshi, Darumaya Sashichi, 1841 to 1916, and comprised the Gesaku Rokkasen and Gesakusha Shoden. Kozo, in addition to Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, had acquired the Gesaku Rokkasen and Gesakusha Shoden. It may be that with the cooperation of Iwamoto Katoshi, who managed an antiquarian bookshop, Honma Kozo obtained a manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō, namely Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō. And it may also have been through this situation and relationship that Gesakusha Ryakuden was included as an appendix in Shinzo-ho Ukiyo-e ruikō. However, in 1868, Keio 4, Meiji 1, Darumaya Goichi, 1817 to 1868, died, and the Darumaya business was inherited by the second son of his second wife, Iwamoto Tetsunosuke. Darumaya Goichi's adopted son, Iwamoto Katoshi, called himself Fumiya Sanji and managed an antiquarian bookshop business separate to Darumaya, and it is said he really didn't like wishy-washy books in the so-called Darumaya style. In that case, Honma Kozo may have obtained Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, Gesaku Rokkasen, Gesakusha Shoden, etc. by another route. It is not clear to what extent Fumiya Sanji, Iwamoto Katoshi, was involved, but it is more than possible that Honma Kozo acquired Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, Gesaku Rokkasen, and Gesakusha Shoden from antiquarian book businesses such as Darumaya and Fumiya. One more question is what happened to the manuscript of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō after Honma Kozo used it to publish Shinzo-ho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Of course, it is very likely that Kozo continued to keep it in his collection. Another possibility is that it went from Kozo to Hayashi Tadamasa and then overseas, for example, to France. Of course, after the publication of Shinzo-ho Ukiyo-e ruikō, it was probably not necessary for anyone to acquire the manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō, but it is likely that there were several collectors in France who would have sought to acquire such a manuscript. Christophe Marquet, born in 1965, beg your pardon, of the French National Institute for Oriental Languages and Civilization, states that in the dawn of the study in France of Japanese art history, which was the latter half of the 19th century, the Ukiyo-e ruikō was a very influential work for French collectors and researchers. According to Marquet's research, there were at least 2 manuscripts of the Ukiyo-e ruikō which had crossed over to Paris by the end of the 19th century. One of these is currently held in the library of the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris. It is the Ukiyo-e ruikō manuscript which was formerly in the collection of Samuel Bing, 1838 to 1905. It is said to include self-portraits of ukiyo-e artists and gesakusha fiction writers. It was edited on or after Meiji 10 and Bing acquired it in 1891, Meiji 24. The self-portraits of ukiyo-e artists and gesakusha may have some connection with Gesaku Rokkasen. One more Ukiyo-e ruikō manuscript is currently held at the library of the Gime Art Museum. This is Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō. It is in the same lineage as the manuscript used by Honma Kozo when he published the Shinzo-ho Ukiyo-e ruikō. I would like to know the circumstances under which the Gime Art Museum acquired this manuscript of the Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō. When he says he would like to know it, I presume he doesn't know it. In fact, the manuscript of the Ukiyo-e ruikō, which is held at the library of the Gime Art Museum, Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, was used for the translation of Ukiyo-e ruikō into French. A Japanese named Kawamura Shiro translated it into French, and a manuscript of almost 400 pages was created, but it was never published. The French manuscript appears to have been used a great deal. Kawamura Shiro worked at the Gime Art Museum for 8 years, from 1886, Meiji 19, until 1894, Meiji 27, and was apparently involved in the translation of various documents. Kawamura Shiro stayed in Paris from 1893, Meiji 26, until 1894, and together with Doki Horyu, 1854 to 1923, of the Shingon sect of Buddhism, produced a French edition of Shido-inzu, regarding the gestures of the officiant in the mystic ceremonies of the Tendai and Shingon sects. The Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō, edited by Ryutei Tanehiko, third, Takabatake Ransen. Next, I would like to discuss the manuscript of Ukiyo-e Ruikō, edited by Ryutei Tanehiko III, Takabatake Ransen, called Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō, the Tanehiko book, and mentioned by Gonkuo in his Utamaro. Taking into consideration that Gonkuo's Utamaro was published in 1891, Meiji 24, Hayashi Tadamasa must have already collected the Tanehiko book, Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō, in 1890, Meiji 23. Hayashi Tadamasa must have used it to help Gonkuo in his writing of Utamaro. I wonder where Ernest Sato has gone in all of this. Anyway, furthermore, in the preface of this book, it was stated that Gonkuo referred to a translation of Ukiyo-e Ruikō in his Hokusai. In other words, when Gonkuo published Hokusai in 1896, Meiji 29, in that preface, he referred to the translation from Japanese to French offered to him by the French doctor Paul Michaud, working in a hospital in Yokohama, regarding references to Hokusai in the Ukiyo-e Ruikō. From the fact that the version of Ukiyo-e Ruikō also included the names of Ryutei Tanehiko and Santo Kyozan, it is clear that it was a Tanehiko book, Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō. Thus, when Gonkuo wrote his two great works, Utamaro and Hokusai, the version of Ukiyo-e Ruikō used was the Tanehiko book, Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō. Regarding the manuscript in Hayashi Tadamasa's former collection of Ukiyo-e Ruikō, edited by Ryutei Tanehiko III, Takabatake Ransen, called Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō, nowadays two copies are extant. One is the Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō held by the Maeda family of the Kaga domain in the Sonkei Kaku Bunko. The other is held in the Yokohama Central Library as Ukiyo-e Ruikō, Yokohama Zote book, and is from the former collection of Kojima Usui. According to Nakashima Osamu, who investigated the Yokohama manuscript, although it is written in a different hand to the Kaga manuscript, the content is virtually the same, and they both have the seal, ex libris mark, of Hayashi Tadamasa. The Yokohama book, according to the former collector Kojima Usui, was among the picture books and Nishiki-e color prints when Hayashi Tadamasa's house was auctioned off. Since both books bear the collector's seal of Hayashi Tadamasa, and they are almost the same, it seems correct to call them both Tanehiko books. It may be supposed that Hayashi Tadamasa first acquired the manuscript of Ukiyo-e Ruikō, edited by Ryutei Tanehiko III, Takabatake Ransen, called Zote Ukiyo-e Ruikō. After that, he requested someone else to produce an exact copy of the contents of the manuscript. As a result, there are now the two manuscripts, the Kaga book and the Yokohama book. However, the authors of the manuscripts are different. Both manuscripts are formerly from Hayashi Tadamasa's collection. Later, I will introduce the preface and postscript. But in the preface of the Yokohama manuscript, there is Ryutei Tanehiko Ki, and in the postscript, Meiji 13, January, Ryutei Master. Again, in another place, there is died Meiji 19, November, in an entry about Toyokuni IV, a minor artist, not the famous Utagawa Toyokuni, also known as Kunisada and Toyokuni III, 1786 to 1865. This meant that Kojima Usui regarded this Tanehiko book, Yokohama manuscript, with great suspicion. This is because the first generation Ryutei Tanehiko died in Tempo 13, 1842. The second Tanehiko, Ryutei Senka, in Keio 2, 1866, and the third Tanehiko, Takabatake Ransen, in Meiji 18, 1885. So Meiji 13, January, Ryutei Master must be the third Tanehiko, but he could not have written anything in Meiji 19, having already died the previous year. However, the Yokohama manuscript, Tanehiko book, according to Kojima Usui, is not a complete forgery, for though it is not written in Tanehiko's hand, even if we calculate this to be the case, it has a certain value as having the name of a Tanehiko book. The preface and postscript of this book are quoted below from Nakashima Osamu's book. Inserted words are indicated with square brackets. The Ukiyo-e Ruikō was compiled by Sasaya Shinshichiro and Santo Kyoden with insertions by Shikite Samba. The appendix was compiled by Kuninori Shinshichiro in Kansei 12, 1800, with insertions by Samba, and the postscript Suiko, created in Kyowa 2, 1802, also had insertions by Samba. The Zoku Ukiyo-e ruikō was compiled in the winter of Tempo 4, 1833, by Mumeo, with further additions by Geshin Shi in the first year of Koka, 1844, and renamed the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. But some parts were still lacking, so Kyōzan-o supplemented Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō and kept it secretly and did not tell it to other people. Someone asked to borrow it from Kyōzan earnestly, made a copy and kept it. Seeing the book after I borrowed it from him, I think it is revised and corrected well. Although I have added a little about matters since the Ansei era, Kyōzan-o died in Ansei 5, 1858, I have kept all the parts. If you find mistakes, I wish you to correct them. Described by Ryutei Tanehiko. To the Ukiyo-e ruikō, compiled by Santo Momoki or Santo Kyōzan, I added only 2 or 3 parts and a few corrections. I wish the people who are interested in the same field to supplement it. Meiji 13, January, Ryutei Master. So it's almost like, I don't know, an open source Wikipedia, isn't it? He's asking people to make corrections and additions. Quite interesting. Okay, let's go on. The preface, etc., of the Tanehiko book, Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō, resembles the preface of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. As indicated by the former collector, Kojima Usui, the Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō and the Shinzoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, as regards the ruikō main text and the appendix, were created by Sasaya Kuninori and Santo Kyoden, with insertions by Samba, with an addition, postscript by Kuninori, also with insertions by Samba, and to these 3 parts there were further notes added to the book collected by Ota Shokuzan at the start of the Bunsei era, 1818 to 30, and the Zoku ruikō, with editing by Mumeo Eisen, is approximately the same. The above contains many quotations and it may be a little difficult to understand, but in short, as Kojima Usui states, there are parts of the 2 books which are identical. Again, as regards the Yokohama book, Tanehiko book, according to the investigation by Nakashima Osamu, this book is a Shukin book in the lineage of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, with many additions and a very interesting manuscript, acquired by various people who added a new preface in place of the old, and a postscript. And the reputable art dealer Hayashi Tadamasa added his seal and probably produced a number of copies. In other words, we can say that the Yokohama book, Tanehiko book, is the Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, but with some changes and additions to the manuscript. So when Wikipedia's articles are created, there's always, if there are changes, they're always listed with who made the change. So it would have been quite useful to have something like that here, I feel. Nakashima Osamu refers to the Yokohama book, Tanehiko book, together with others in the lineage of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, for example, the Tokyo National Museum's Yokose book, Ukiyo-e ruikō, and the Tenri Library's book, Tenri book, Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō. This is a very interesting point. Nakashima Osamu suggests that the Yokohama book, Tanehiko book, is a greatly expanded version of the Yokose book and is the original text for the Tenri book. The Tenri book was created by Baifu Shi, Hyodo Baifu, and Nakashima guesses that Baifu Shi was the compiler of the Yokohama book, Tanehiko book. But the problem is, who exactly was Baifu Shi? I think that Hayashi Motoharu, 1858 to 1903, may have been one possible candidate, but this is not yet confirmed. Above, I have indicated that the manuscript Gesaku Rokkasen, now held by Kansai University Library, was the original text of the Ansei Sannen Katoshi Jo, which was formerly in the collection of Takabatake Ransen Ryutei Tanehiko III, and that Takabatake Ransen was the author of Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō in the former collection of Hayashi Tadamasa, that the Gesaku Rokkasen is included in Honma Kozo's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, and that these 3 people, Takabatake, Hayashi, and Honma, had some kind of connection between them. Probably Baifu Shi, Hyodo Baifu, who prepared Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, had some connection with Takabatake Ransen and an ukiyo-e artist, artist. I guess that the Ukiyo-e artist was Hayashi Motoharu. So, from talk of the manuscript of the Yokohama book, Tanihiko book, and its compilers, let us return to the preface of the Tanihiko book, Zote Ukiyo-e Riko. Above I have quoted from the beginning of Edmond de Goncourt's book, Utamaro, where he refers to Ukiyo-e Riko. At that time, he stated that Ukiyo-e Riko was a handwritten manuscript prepared by Santo Kyoden, which was then revised by Shikite Samba, Mumeo, Saito Geshin, and Ryute Tanihiko. If we list up the people mentioned in the preface to the Yokohama book, Tanihiko book, in order they are Sasaya Shinshichiro, Santo Kyoden, Shikite Samba, Mumeo, Santo Kyozan, and Ryute Tanihiko. Apart from Sasaya Shinshichiro and Santo Kyozan, these are all mentioned by Goncourt. What is particularly important is the last mentioned Ryute Tanihiko. Santo Kyozan is not mentioned by Goncourt in his Utamaro, but he is accurately mentioned in Hokusai, sorry. Where did I get Kyozai? Okay. From the main persons mentioned in the preface to the Yokohama book, Tanihiko book, and those quoted by Goncourt, we can guess that Hayashi Tadamasa had 2 copies of Zote Ukiyo-e Riko in his collection, and that he gave the information contained in them to Goncourt for the writing of his Utamaro. Why did he have 2 copies in his collection? Perhaps he had 1 copy in Tokyo and 1 in Paris. So at what point in time did Hayashi Tadamasa acquire the Zote Ukiyo-e Riko Tanihiko book? In the book, it is stated that Toyokuni IV died in February 1886, Meiji 19. So the Zote Ukiyo-e Riko was published in 1887. Hayashi Tadamasa returned to Japan in the summer of 1888, and in May 1889, he went to Paris to work as an inspector at the World Fair. He probably acquired the Zote Ukiyo-e Riko while he was in Japan, leaving 1 copy in Japan and taking the other with him to Paris. It was probably this second copy which allowed him to give useful information to Goncourt. However, in the preface to Hokusai, Goncourt expresses his gratitude to Dr. Paul Michaud, who worked in a Yokohama hospital, for his translation into French from the Zote Ukiyo-e Riko of the part relating to Hokusai, so it may be difficult to confirm where the 2 copies of Zote Ukiyo-e Riko were. Goncourt was in Paris, Hayashi Tadamasa was coming and going between France and Japan, while Paul Michaud worked in Yokohama, but returned to France and visited Goncourt. This complicated situation makes it difficult to ascertain the whereabouts of both copies. But again, Paris and France are featuring strongly at the same time as the Olympics are going on. It's quite amusing. Okay. Hayashi Tadamasa and Sharaku and Instigator X. In this chapter, I have referred to various problems relating to Ukiyo-e Riko, but at the end I must mention the one which is most concerning about Sharaku. I want to discuss the topic of how the longing for Sharaku's works overseas, particularly in France, was answered. As Suzuki Juzo states in his book Sharaku, Kodansha 1966, the American art historian Ernest Fenollosa, in his catalogue of the Ukiyo-e exhibition at Ikao Onsen 1898, introduces Sharaku in the following way. The catalogue was edited by the Ukiyo-e art dealer Kobayashi Bunshichi, 1861 to 1923, and was published from his shop Hosu Kaku. Number 191, Sharaku, print, large head of an actor in female part, about Kwansei 6th, 1794. Sharaku was a wild genius who appeared during Kwansei. His ugliness was so intense that he must have appealed to but a limited class. American collectors hate him. Some French collectors, however, are ready to extol him as one of the greatest Ukiyo-e artists. He is the deification of ugliness and so decadent of the decadence. Wow, that's pretty damning, isn't it? I don't much care for that. Poor old Sharaku. It's getting pretty severely criticized there. The most interesting point about Ernest Fenollosa's comment here is that American collectors hate Sharaku, but some French collectors praise him as one of the greatest ukiyo-e artists. From his catalogue published in 1898, we know that at the end of the 19th century, Sharaku's reputation in America was low, but in France, he was considered a great ukiyo-e painter alongside Hokusai and Utamaro. On. In the December 1985 edition of Rekishi Dokuhon, there was a special feature, Find the Mysterious Ukiyo-e Artist Sharaku. In that special feature, the author Tomita Yoshikazu wrote in an essay, mysterious person Hayashi Tadamasa, instigator of the Sharaku boom. There were many ukiyo-e artists around Tadamasa, the man who took Sharaku's paintings overseas. According to Tomita's article, the large number of Sharaku's works appearing in Europe was the result of Hayashi's exporting activity, and as a result, by the beginning of the 20th century, there were no Sharaku works in Japan. In other words, by the end of the 19th century, many of Sharaku's works had been exported to France and elsewhere by Hayashi Tadamasa. Tomita Yoshikazu's article develops further as follows. Apart from Sharaku's first major printing of 28 works, he guesses that an instigator X close to Hayashi Tadamasa employed ukiyo-e artists working in the Utagawa Toyokuni style and sold their works overseas. In Tomita's article, he suggests Kobayashi Bunshichi as a candidate for instigator X, but if it was not him, it may have been Honma Kozo, or it may have been a third person in addition to these two. In the preface, I mentioned that Ernest Sato, hooray, we returned to him. Ernest Sato collected Sharaku's work. It is quite unclear how or why Sato began to collect Sharaku's masterpieces, but the possible periods of collection were the 3 years from about 1880 to the end of 1882, and the years when he was British minister in Japan from 1895 to 1900, and probably he mainly collected them in Japan. However, it is only a guess, but if we consider Hayashi Tadamasa's role in selling Sharaku's woodblock prints overseas, it is possible that Sato may have acquired some Nishiki-e coloured prints from that source. The London auctioneer Sotheby's in 1911, from January 24th to 27th, 4 days, offered for auction the collected artworks of 4 collectors which had been ukiyo-e prints in the former collection of Hayashi Tadamasa. Hayashi Tadamasa died in 1906, and the 4 collectors who had bought ukiyo-e prints from him were A.C. Tyler, Ernest Sato, R.S. Miller, and Samuel Tuke. At the time of the auction, it was made clear that they were from the former collection of Hayashi Tadamasa. Sotheby's also produced a catalogue of the auction, which included Sato's works. From this catalogue, it is clear that Sato did purchase ukiyo-e from Hayashi Tadamasa, so it is therefore quite possible that he bought Sharaku's works from Hayashi also. And I think that may be, yes, that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2, there it is, how Sato acquired the Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko. So we can hope for plenty of discussion of Sato in chapter 2. All right, I think I will leave it there. Stop the share. And thank you very much. And I will see you again soon. Goodbye now. Bye-bye.